Welcome to the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, where we have uncensored conversations, we exchange information, we provide a ton of resources for all the listeners and the watchers of this podcast. Yes, that's right. I said watchers. This podcast is going to be streaming on all major platforms. It will be available in video format via Spotify and our YouTube channel, which is Penton Pending Consultant Solutions LLC. I am your Fire Medic CEO, LP. Got a very special guest in the building that I can't wait to talk to. This is part one of many. I'm not going to even give it a final. It's going to be just an infinite number, I believe, because we just got so much to cover and talk about. And I absolutely just believe that this woman is just phenomenal beyond anything. So let me give you all the disclaimers and all that good stuff before we get started, because again, this is the Trigger Warning Talk podcast, sponsored by Anchor, produced by Pending Consultant Solutions LLC. And again, I want to thank everybody for joining us here. We talk about four major topics under the umbrella of public and mental health. Those are domestic violence, sexually based offenses, human and sex trafficking, and we end every episode with a missing person case. This is going to be a very interesting case that I got from Mrs. LP, our in-house missing person detective, true crime detective. Everything that she does is just phenomenal. You know, I might be biased, but if I wasn't married to her and I knew the same things that I know about her, I would say the same thing. That's how I get out of the bias thing. But you and I will talk about that later, Fee. Anyway, seriously though, if you're triggered at any point during this podcast, please call 911. Police, fire, EMS, they start the process of getting help. If you don't have an immediate need, you can call any one of the numbers that we will have listed. As we do in every show, in all the notes, we have the numbers for domestic violence, sexual assault. That includes the number for RAIN, which is rape, incest, abuse, incest, national network. We have, again, domestic violence, trafficking, RAIN. If you have substance abuse issues, be it alcohol or drugs, we have AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. If you are a loved one or a supporter of one of those individuals with one of those issues, we have Al-Anon. We have all that information provided in the show notes. And finally, if you are suicidal or know somebody that's suicidal, call 988. 988. That's the new 911 number that's here in the U.S. nationwide for suicidal ideation issues. I want to introduce our guest, who is very, very instrumental in getting us to focus on the shit that we deal with sometimes, unfortunately, in our world. And those are some of these heavy-weighted topics that we cover in the Trigger Warning Talk podcast. Her name is Fe, or we call her Fee. Some people say Fe. And it always cracks me up when we're in some of these spaces, when I hear Fe, I hear Fee, I hear all kinds of stuff. Her name is Fe Schoenjohn. And we're going to have a great conversation today about her story and a number of other things in relationship to traumas. Fe, what do you think is some of the major things that in regards to traumas, just right off the top of your head, in regards to domestic violence and sexual based offenses, because this is October and it is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. What are like the top three things that you tend to focus on with the clients that you serve when it comes to domestic violence issues?
Well, first and foremost, I definitely want to make sure that anyone that I am counseling or advising, because I like to say that I advise because I don't treat anyone, I don't heal anyone as a trauma shaman. All I do is I provide them with a blueprint, and so that they can do the work, the necessary work that's needed for them to heal. So definitely, one of the first things that I think about, like firsthand, is just allowing my client to feel validated, because that's one of the biggest problems with DV, SA, and some of the other forms of of trauma that one experiences is just being able to be validated, because in a society that really kind of shuns what's really going on in the grand scheme of things, we need to make sure that our victims feel like they're being heard, but then more importantly that they have access to resources, and that they're be allowed to heal. Because when you think about trauma as a whole, it affects every aspect of your life, and it doesn't matter if it's a personal relationship or a professional relationship. It could be something as simple as you having a conversation with your next door neighbor. Trauma affects us in many different ways. And of course, every single person's trauma and the way that they're affected by trauma is different. So, validation right off the bat is just saying, I see you, I hear you, I'm here for you. What happened to you? And by asking questions like that, it allows the victim or the survivor to really be able to guide the conversation, so to speak. Because we have to get to the nature of what happened to someone in order to be able to give them recommendations on treatment or healing or advising of any sort.
I want to give the audience just a brief overview of your background, your CV. Fee, I call her the prophet as she calls herself on her IG. We'll get into that later because y'all just don't understand. And if you're watching this recording, the title of this is Trauma Shaman, Breaking Generational Curses, Part 1 with Fe Schoenjohn. Fee is a mental health global ambassador. She's the creator of The Healing Place with Fee, which is her podcast. We'll talk about that a little bit later. She's an energy healer. She is a trauma survivor, a victim's advocate of sexual, child, domestic, narcissistic, emotional abuse, etc. She talks a lot about mental health crisis, as I do, because you guys have heard me say this plenty of times, and I coined this. Mental health crisis is the world's oldest continuous pandemic that's been around since the beginning of mankind, and it ain't going nowhere. We got to deal with the stigmas, the taboos, the stereotypes, the pain, the judgment, the traumas, and so many other things that I can add to that list that we're going to talk about in this particular beginning series that Fee and I are going to be doing. Fee is a trauma shaman. Now, I did an episode before a couple months ago with Marcelo Gonzalez, and we talked about shadow work, and we dispelled a lot of myths and misconceptions and some other things in relationship to the work that she does with her clients that are traumatized from DV, from sexual assaults, and from trafficking. And we're going to talk about some of those things from Fee's perspective. Fee, I want to get kind of started from your humble beginnings. Like we all have humble beginnings. Where are you from?
So I'm from Chicago. I was born and raised on the South Side over in Inglewood neighborhood.
Okay.
As most people know, Inglewood's been in the news quite often, quite regularly,
Yeah.
and it's not for good. So I'm hoping that by way of me being a native from Inglewood, that people get to see Inglewood from a completely different perspective, because the connotations behind when you hear Inglewood, it's not necessarily a good thing. And there are good things and good people that come out of really bad environments, and I'm definitely a testament to that.
What was life like for young Fee in the South Side of Chicago?
Well, I mean, life for Lil Fee was well, I hate to use the word horrible, but it really was. There were moments where my childhood was somewhat hopeful, but I'd say that the majority of my childhood was marred with trauma, all kinds of pain and suffering. I mean, there was child abuse in my household, there was sexual assault that happened to me all through high school from by a security officer. I was beaten along with my sister and my half brother as a child. I was sexually assaulted by a relative, and my sister, so she was as well. She was sexually assaulted by her father. But then I also had to witness that because we shared the same bed. And so I'm the only person that knows exactly verbatim what happened in those experiences. But then I didn't realize this until I was older that, that was a generational curse there because my mother, she was also a victim, and potentially my grandmother, and who knows how many further generations back. And so it made me question a lot of things. It made me question life as a whole because of the fact that I came from this environment where there was no love. We were not inspired to be anything other than just what we were, and that was, in my eyes, we were considered property or cattle. So I never aspired to be a whole lot when I was younger. I mean, and when I tell you I disassociated a lot when I was a kid, I disassociated so much that it took me probably about 10 years to learn how to not disassociate, or to learn when disassociation is okay. Because my entire childhood, even though I was presently in one place, mentally I was always someplace else. I was never where I was supposed to be. So it took a lot for me to have to go through all of the things that I experienced in my childhood to get to where I am today. I mean, like I said, there were moments where my childhood, it didn't seem like it was so bad. And I would say probably when I was as young as maybe 7 or 8, life didn't seem that bad. It seemed, somewhat normal. And even after, with all the trauma that I experienced, it seemed normal. And it was only after I got out of that environment that I realized that all this bullshit, this trauma that happened to me, that's not normal behavior. That should never be normalized under any circumstances whatsoever.
Were there any safety measures put in place to help minimize those traumas that you experienced from your caregivers, be it your parents or whoever raised you?
No, I mean, in my family, all of the trauma that happened, it happened to my mother's children. So there was a lot of different things going on there. So there was definitely colorism that happened, that transpired, because my mother's family, my grandmother and the rest of the relatives that lived in the household, they were all very, very dark skinned. And as you can see, I'm pretty fair skinned. And then my siblings were just probably a couple of shades darker than I am. And so I noticed that all of the harsh punishments, all of the harsh treatments was experienced by my mother and her kids. Whereas my cousins, they, in so many ways, they lived in the lap of luxury. They wore better, they dressed really nicely. They had, they came from a loving, cultivated relationship with their mom. I mean, she was their protector. She shielded them, and we didn't have that as kids. So, I mean, even in our household, there was no safety measures. There was no safe person that we can go and talk to. And in fact, when my mother found out about my sister, and the fact that her father was molesting her, it was kind of swept under the rug as if it was never to be talked about again. It was like a little dirty secret that our family just carried around with them forever. And so when it came down to it, when it happened to me, I kept quiet because I'm like, why am I going to say something about what happened to me, because they didn't do anything for my sister. In fact, they swept it under the rug. And so when it happened to my sister, we didn't receive any therapy. We didn't even so much as receive a hug or any kind of consoling. There was no therapist brought in. The police were never called. It literally was like one day it happened. The next day it was like, okay, well, what's going on in the world? And that was it.
This is the Trigger One to Talk podcast. If you're triggered at any point during this podcast, which is sponsored by Anchor, produced by Pending Consulting Solutions LLC. Again, if you're triggered at any point during this podcast, please call 911. If you don't have an immediate need, we have a number of resources listed in the show notes for this podcast, as well as other episodes that we've done for domestic violence, trafficking, the RAIN organization, which is Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. If you have substance abuse issues, whether it be alcohol or drugs, we have Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and Al-Anon. And if you have any suicidal ideation issues, you or anybody else that may be in contact with, call 988. That number is the number that the government set up nationwide here in the States for, suicidal ideation. also a number of other behavioral health issues that they're adding to that hotline. So, talking with Fee, Fee, I want to move forward just a little bit here because one of the things that you and I have talked about before is we like having dialogue with solution based action plans because we know if you're just talking, it's just a fucking trauma dump, and that
Mhm.
doesn't help anybody or anything like that. What was the rock bottom moment for you in terms of the childhood traumas that you endured? Because I know some of these other things happen also because we're talking about generational curses. So we're going to talk about some of the things you experienced in your young adulthood ages. What was kind of that rock bottom moment that those things, when those things happened, where you were like, "Hey, something's got to give here."
Oh man, I remember that day like it was yesterday. I was in my late 20s, and I had already attempted suicide twice before time. And
Okay.
the third time, I was in my late 20s. I was somewhere between like 27 and 29. And I had moved on with my life, moved out to the suburbs, and had a reasonably healthy relationship. I had a great job, the whole bit. And one day I just came home, and something inside of me said, "Today's the day." And I knew exactly what that meant. Even though I didn't want to face the music, I knew what time it was. And so I proceeded to take somewhere between 50 to 70 pills of Vicodin. And I laid down in the bed, and I thought that was it. And the guy that I was dating at the time, he came home from work, and he noticed that the phone was off the hook. And he's like, "That's strange. Phone's off the hook. The dog is in his kennel, and he's howling." And that's just really bizarre because the dog never did that. And so he came into our bedroom that we shared and noticed that I was in the bed. I was completely covered up from head to toe, and the lights were on. And so he pulled the covers back, and he noticed that I was blue, literally blue. And I had this rather weird out of body experience where he was trying to revive me, but I couldn't move. I was literally I was paralyzed, but I was hovering above myself where I could see exactly everything that was going on, the people that were in the room, but I couldn't do anything. And so um, after I was transported, as I was being transported to the hospital, excuse me, I suffered a seizure in the back of the ambulance, which I remember.
Okay.
And after that, everything went black. Well, I didn't know that when everything went black that I had went into cardiac arrest. And so I woke up a couple of days later out of a medically induced coma with tubes down my throat and hearing doctors. They were standing by my bedside kind of whispering, like, "We don't know what she's taken, but she's lucky to be here." And so they looked over, and they must have started trying to wake me up out of this coma
Mhm.
because they looked over and I was looking right at them. And so one of the physicians, he came over and he stood by my bedside and he's like, "I don't know what's going on in your life, but you're very lucky to be here because I don't know if you even realize the magnitude of what had happened, but you had a seizure in the back of the ambulance. And then shortly thereafter, you went into cardiac arrest." So I was dead by the time they brought me to the hospital. And the only thing they could think to do was to pump me full of charcoal to absorb the pills that I had taken, which they didn't know the amount,
Right.
and then just put me in a coma and hope that I would be okay. And so having that conversation, that very polarizing conversation with that doctor, made me realize that I had to do something different. And it was from that point forward that I started therapy. And I continue therapy into this day, and I'm 47.
I'm so glad that those medical professionals, including the EMS crew that responded initially, were able to do the work that they're trained to do. Shout out to my fellow EMS folks, because I'm a paramedic and a firefighter. So shout out to them for providing great care to you that continued on in hospital, that allowed you to be revived, to be resuscitated, and continue on with your beautiful life. I want to ask you about one thing real quick before we move on. You said this was your third suicidal attempt. What happened with the first two? Obviously, you weren't successful, thankfully. But what happened with the first two? Because you don't hear too many people saying that they had multiple attempts and they're here. Most of
Mhm.
the time when I get involved is either the first attempt or it may have been the third attempt and they were successful on their third time. So what was it for you that made you do these multiple attempts I mean, because I talk about suicide all the time as a mental health crisis. And being a paramedic, I've responded on calls where sometimes we were able to help them, and sometimes I had to pronounce
So the first two attempts they happened in my early 20s.
it.
And at that time, I was still living in our family home. And so this was shortly after. So now to kind of push us back a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, so I lost my mother a week before my 18th birthday. And then about a month and a half later, I gave birth to my first child, which was a girl. And at that time, the relationship, or what I thought was a relationship, that I was in, is I was being groomed by an older man, and he eventually, groomed me to the point that I let my guard down, and he took advantage of my vulnerability, and a pregnancy became of that. And so, imagine walking around with an anvil attached to your head, not understanding why. And the reason why I refer to an anvil, because it's like a lot of pressure and it's heavy. And so
Yes.
for me, I walked around with this heaviness and I didn't understand why. I didn't understand the nature of this heaviness. And so the first two times that I tried to attempt suicide in the family home, I was trying to somehow get rid of that stress, that pain, because I hadn't even grieved yet from losing my mother. And so dealing with the fallout of my mother passing away, never having a relationship with my father, and then going on subsequently to have a child that I didn't want, or that was the result of a groomed relationship. There was a lot of stress. Plus, on top of that, my family, they were putting a lot of pressure on me that, okay, yeah, you're a mom now and you've got to take care of your kid, but we're not here to support you. And oh, by the way, we need you to pay money and do this, that, and that in the house if you're going to live here. So that I had pressure coming from all angles of my life, and I'm just trying to figure out what are the easiest ways to get rid of the stress and pressure. Because you have to remember, in the Black community, the idea of going to see a therapist, or as they call them, shrinks, that was not something that Black people did.
That's right.
And in fact, I've had a lot of Black people say to me, "I don't need to pay somebody to teach me how to run my life." And I'm like, "Well, hold on. It's not about teaching you how to run your life. It's teaching you how to navigate your life and navigate your life through those tough times." And so because of that, mental health was never something that was ever championed in our household. Nobody cared about our mental health. Nobody gave a shit about anything as it relates to us. And so because I felt worthless, because I felt more like property as opposed to feeling like a human, I was like, I don't want to be here. My mother, she's already left me. I want to go where she's going. I want to go where she's at. That's the only place that I felt love. And so those are the reasons why I tried to attempt suicide. Granted, I wasn't successful, and secondly, nobody gave a shit that I laid down in the basement for 2 3 days unconscious. Nobody cared. And so it was like, all right, great. Nobody cares if I was to die today. Nobody would give a shit. They didn't give a shit before. And so it was just one of those things. It was like, I just want to get rid of this pressure. I just want to feel like I don't have to cry anymore. I want to feel like I belong here, because I felt like first of all, I never felt like I belonged in my family. And then after my mother passed away, I felt like the only person that was there, that was in my corner, she's been taken away from me. And now I'm left to my own demise. And why do I want to be here? I have nothing, no reason to live. And that was my mindset.
I'm so glad that you talked about that because, again, when we talk about mental health crisis, suicidal ideation is on the rise. And more people are being successful than just the attempt. It's the attempt and they're being successful with it. So I like having conversations about that because, again, this is Trigger Warning Talk podcast. And so we always say we don't do the iceberg conversations, the 10% that you see that people just want to talk about. There's 90% that's under the water that's not visible to the eye, but it's there. So I say either let's flip that iceberg upside down. Here's everything that we really need to talk about that you kind of push into the side for whatever reasons. And we can talk about those reasons, or we can keep it underwater. I got some scuba gear. Let's deep dive because that's what we're getting ready to do. Deep dive into this shit. I want to move forward to one thing. You talked about not only the suicide issues, but you talked about the issues that you had with this pregnancy by this older guy who you and he produced this beautiful young daughter. And I know that having a child can change a lot of the traumas that we have, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. For you, what was it like dealing with this unplanned pregnancy in the midst of this trauma that you're dealing with from this older man?
It actually made my trauma worse. I mean, I was like, just when I thought that life couldn't get any worse, here's another sign. And so while I don't see my daughter as something that I wish that never happened, because she's a beautiful young lady in her own right, she was a little bit of a reminder of that trauma that I experienced by the hands of her own father. And so that's even something that I've had to reconcile, is that I had to come to the realization that my daughter was not created out of a loving environment, not even an environment of connectiveness. It was an environment where he manipulated me. He swooned me. He knew that I was in a very vulnerable state. He knew my family. He knew all of the dynamics in which that was going on, and he took advantage of that opportunity to say, let me just slide in there while she's already raw and exposed, and I'm just going to go ahead and just do whatever it is that I need to do to get my own satisfaction out of the situation. So it really compounded the trauma, and it made it even more challenging for me to deal with, because not only now that I have to think about myself, but I have to think about this child, and what's going to be important to help her become her better self. And how do I not allow myself to allow her father be the reason why I don't have a connection with her?
When we did our pre-interview, one of the things that you told me about yourself was that you are an athlete.
Yeah.
You are a multi-athlete. And I was like, okay, I did sports. I did martial arts. I ran track. I lettered in that. I was on the wrestling team, lettered in that. For you, tell us about the athletics that you participated in and how that played a part in kind of giving you an escape temporarily from some of these traumas.
So I look at my athleticism as another component of my healing, because I was always told I can never do X, Y, and Z. And so what I like to do is I like to prove people wrong. So when I've had people in my past say, "Oh, you probably shouldn't do that," I'm like, "Hold my beer, watch this," and then I go and do it. And so that's how I got into all the sports that I've gotten into. And I didn't even get into sports until I was in my 30s. That was when I felt like when I was in my 30s, I became more adventurous. My comfort zone, I had reached my comfort zone, but I also was able to heal from all my trauma, that I was going to use this as a way to celebrate. And so I, I dated a guy who was a snowboarder who taught me everything that I knew, and then all I did was I just really capitalized on that and started going out west and, just having fun out there on the slopes, competing. And it was just like real minor stuff, but to me, it felt like it was real big. I used to slalom water ski. I played golf. And at one point I used to be a scratch golfer. So I still play golf to this day. And I don't focus my efforts as much as I used to on golf, but I can go out there and swing the golf club better than anybody. And I guarantee you, I can play with some men and they will even be like, wow, did she really just play from the men's black tees? Yes, she did. She didn't play from the women's tees. And I've had people ask me that. They're like, why do you play from the men's black tees? I'm like, well,
Why not?
because I am not trying to impress you. This is
Right.
me challenging myself. This is me showing myself that I'm more capable of what I can put out than what people tell me I should do.
Okay.
And so I used to shoot bow and arrow. I skateboard. I mean, I do all kinds of crazy shit because I feel like life is, we only get one time to make the best of life. And I'm going to have fun for as long as I can. And then, of course, I have a son now. So my son, he's 11. And so I envisioned that some of these activities that was once my passions, that I can now bring into my relationship with my son and use it as a bonding experience for us. So I have yet to meet a sport that I have yet to be able to dominate in. So don't tell me
Oh,
I can't do it because I will go out there and show you up.
we're going to jump into the meat and potatoes section, as I call it, of this podcast, which is the Trigger One to Talk podcast. We talk about generational curses, and that's what we're going to talk about, generational curses. And so this is part one of that from a shadow work perspective, because you, my dear, call yourself the trauma shaman. And we talk about metaphysics all the time. I always interview metaphysicians on this podcast that focus on different modalities in terms of mental health that's available. Will you tell us what a trauma shaman is?
That's a funny question because it's even a question that I have to ask myself. Because my spirit guides were the one that told me that I'm supposed to be the trauma shaman. And I'm like, what the hell is a trauma shaman? So, of course, I had to go back to my spirit guides and go, I need you to explain to me what a trauma shaman is so that when I'm asked what a trauma shaman is, I can articulate it and people go, damn, I never thought of it that way. So, a trauma shaman is such that I use the experiences that I've had in my life, including my childhood trauma, the healing that came from that, because and my unconventional way of healing, because yes, I did go and I went through many years of therapy, but I also incorporated other things, meditation and yoga and music therapy, art therapy, just silence, grounding, earthing. I've incorporated all these different things into my healing regimen, so to speak. So what I do is I use the experiences of my own, everything from the trauma itself to the healing, to show people that they have the capacity to be able to heal as long as they are able and willing to turn within themselves to do the necessary work, like the shadow work, the inner child healing. Because the inner child healing, that's where all of the trauma that one experiences, that's exactly where it comes from. Is that inner child needs to be healed, and especially someone that has experienced childhood trauma, you have to go back to the source itself, and that's when you were a child, to understand the why things happen, but then more importantly, how you shouldn't hold yourself hostage because you weren't the one that was responsible for the trauma that happened to you. The people that were there to protect you, or those that took advantage of your vulnerability, those are the ones that are responsible. So I show people the blueprint, so to speak, to say, hey, this isn't your shit. You don't have to hold on to it. You don't need it to affect you your entire life. You need to learn to let go of this. And they go, how? This is how. You work with a licensed clinician, because I am by no means, I can't fix you. You have to do the work. And it is important that each individual do the work, because then they have the understanding, the knowledge of the why, the how, and then hopefully they will be able to utilize that information to then go on and articulate it in such a manner that they can help someone else in their trauma, their healing journey, so to speak. So that's what the trauma shaman is. And then I also incorporate my metaphysical practices in there, whether it's crystals or meditation, music, art therapy, just learning to be still with oneself. I've learned along the way that I have shamanic tendencies. And my spirit guides, they're always in my ears, and they're helping me to deliver messages to myself and other people. But then also my dog happens to be one of my spirit animals. And it's like, if I wasn't in a place where I have evolved to my higher self or my higher consciousness, I wouldn't be able to see any of these things, because I'd still be in that little tiny little trauma box that I put myself in for so long. And as we know, trauma is the gift that keeps giving. Just when you think you've healed from trauma, it manifests itself in a completely different manner, and then you're dealing with trauma all over again. Then you're triggered all over again, and some of those same feelings, even though they might be two separate entities, you're dealing with them all together, as if you're reliving that trauma all over again.
Shadow work. How do you define shadow work?
Shadow work is really, the way that I define it is, you have to sit, whether it's with someone who specializes in shadow work or your therapist, to actually like pick apart your entire being, who you were, who you're becoming, and where do you hope to be. What are some of the characteristics that you exhibited as a child that prevented you from being your best self? What are the traits about yourself that you recognize that are your great characteristics? Because we all know that we have good and bad traits. And so we already know that the good traits, they're always going to be there. They're ever evolving. So we can leave those where they are. It's the traits that are over here, the bad traits, or the traits that we feel like are bad, that we have to focus our efforts on. So if you were in a situation like myself, where you suffered from severe neglect, abandonment, abuse, emotional abuse, just learning, basically what shadow work helps you to do is it helps to remove all of those negative tendencies that we've developed along the way, that was embedded into our brains, whether it was by our family or the environment around us. So it's a way of removing all of those negative traits and learning how to become somebody different, learning about thinking of yourself in much more of a positive manner than a negative manner. Because we all know it's almost like having that devil and the angel on your shoulder. The devil's always in your head going, "You're worthless. You are a piece of shit. Nobody will ever love you. You need to go and kill yourself." If you let the devil get inside your head, it will really fuck you up. And then there's the angel that's going, "No, you are worth it. You are loved. You are cherished. You are a diamond in the rough that deserves to be polished off and put on display." That's what shadow work is to me.
Do you look at shadow work as demonology or evil, conjuring, and all that stuff? Because again, we always want to dispel the myths and the misconceptions about any subject or any subject matter that we're talking about. And as I said before, I've done a podcast with a young lady who talked about shadow work and some of the things that we're talking about today. But I always want to get the guest's individual perspective on that. What do you look at in terms of how some people say, "Oh, this is devil worship and stuff"? Are you talking about crystals and tarot card readings and some witchcraft shit? This is, like some heebie-jeebie stuff. It's dark, it's scary, it's spooky, it's evil, 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 evil. What say you?
Well, when you think about shadow work, imagine being in a dark room and you're trying to navigate a dark room without your eyes being focused, so that you can feel around for what things that potentially could harm you or that you could potentially walk into. Imagine shadow work as being that. What shadow work does is gives you a little bit of a light, like a little flashlight, where you see all these little things that could potentially hurt you. And it could be traits about yourself that you didn't even recognize. So what shadow work does is it helps you to recognize all the negative things that we tell ourselves or that we feel about ourselves, and help us to move through those things so that we can see ourselves in the best light. So is shadow work demonic work or evil work? Absolutely not. I feel like shadow work is a necessary component of one's healing, because you have to not only cultivate and champion all the best bits about you, but you also have to look at the bits about you where that needs improvement, or that you can get rid of, the mindsets and the ideals that we have in our heads. So no, I think Every single one of us that has experienced trauma, which I feel like every single one of us walking this earth is traumatized in some fashion or another. Because if you think about trauma and how it relates to the human spirit is if you experience anything in your life that has left a lasting impression on you, that you feel like it conjures up emotions every single time that you experience it or something similar, guess what? That's trauma. And most people don't see it as such. And so when you've been dealt the kind of hand that I've dealt with all of this trauma, I didn't even realize what shadow work was until about 5 years ago. And then I was like, shadow work. I want to understand that. I want to research that. And then when I really understood what shadow work really meant, I'm like, I need to incorporate this into my healing because I'm constantly trying to find ways to improve myself, to elevate myself to my higher self, to become more consciously aware of my actions and how I navigate through life. And shadow work helps me to get to that point. It's one of the components that is absolutely necessary. And anyone that I counsel or advise, I tell them, in order for you to become whole, where you feel like everything you are doing is coming from a place from love, you have to do that shadow work. You have to look at the things that keeps us stagnant. That when we look at other people living their best lives, if we're passing judgment on them, going, why do they get to live like that and I get to live like this? That's a little bit of shadow work. That's the judgment shadow.
Right.
And you think about, like, even when we talk about people behind their backs, that's a gossip shadow. There's all kinds of shadows. And in fact, I was reading this book. I listened to it on Audible, and it was such a good book that I had to go and I had to purchase it. It's called Shadow Work Peace. I have to remember the name of it. It's called Shadow Work Peace Be Still. I'll get you the name of it. But it was a very, very helpful book because there's activities or journaling that you have to do in conjunction, and it really does help you get along that journey of working through those dark, deep parts of ourselves that we refuse to acknowledge because we want to think of ourselves as just being, very perfect and all this stuff. And as we know, everyone that's born on this planet has a little bit of narcissism in them. And it's just about keeping that narcissism to a minimum so that the narcissism does not take over and be in control of who you are and, more importantly, how you navigate through life.
You know what I thought about when you were talking about the definition of the example you gave of shadow work? It made me think about when I was training for the fire academy. You have burn towers, but the first phase of it is qualifying for this test called the CPAT, the Candidate Physical Agility Test, which is 8 stations that you got to complete in under 10 minutes and 20 seconds. And one of the stations, you're wearing this 50-pound vest the whole time. And so one of them, you have to crawl through this U-shaped um, structure on your hands and knees. And as you're going through each section, it gets darker and darker till it gets pitch black. And like you said, you kind of butt up against the right side of the wall and kind of feel your way as you're crawling through. And as you're going through this U-shape, it's a boxy U-shaped structure, the ceiling gets lower and lower to the point you're literally doing like a crab crawl to the end. And I thought about that. And I was like, man, that sounds like shit. Like you said, you're trying to looking for the light because as you get closer to the end, you do start to see the light when you're on that last section of the exit point, but it's still pretty dark. And so I thought about that and I was like, man, that just sounds like something that I went through when I was doing the fire academy training. I want to ask you about one of the things that we talked about also, not only in relationship to shadow work, but there's this acronym that more and more people are knowing about and talking about. It's called ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience. Can you talk about that?
Whew. So back when I first started going, when I was in therapy, I don't know if the ACE was even like a buzzword at that time. I'd say in the last like 10, 15 years, we start hearing more about ACE. And so you can even go and take the adverse childhood experience test to see exactly how many adverse childhood experiences that you've experienced as a child. And I wasn't surprised, but it put things really into context. So I went onto the website and I took the test, and of course I scored over 10. And
Okay.
if you score anything over 10, that means you need to be talking to a therapist like straight away.
Straight up.
And so for me, I was like, wow, I didn't realize, excuse me, how fucked up my childhood really, it really turned me into this person. And so it's like, okay, now I'm going to have to do that much harder work because now I'm realizing just how fucked up my childhood was. And then more importantly, how it allowed me to navigate through life with these rose colored lenses on that I've been walking around with for God knows forever. So it was very polarizing for me. But it also, when I look back on that ACE test, and I think about all the hard work that I've done to get to where I am, where I can even talk about it without getting triggered, I said, you know what? God doesn't give you more than what you can handle. And perhaps maybe I had to go through some of these things because I had to be the one that was going to break that generational curse. So I had to take the L for it. And I'm grateful that I took that L because now my kids don't have to deal with the adverse childhood experiences. And that was what I was hoping to avoid, is to not have them go through the same exact experiences that I had and have to go through years and years and years of therapy to try to get some sense of normalcy in their life.
NPR, the National Public Radio Organization, has a great ACE test or quiz that I'm going to post the link in the show notes for this particular episode. And again, um, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experience, and this quiz is based on a score from 0 to 10. And the score is a tally of different types of abuse, neglect, and other hallmarks of a rough childhood. So, according to the ACE study, the rougher your childhood, the higher your score is likely to be, and the higher your risk for later health problems. And so, again, I want to post a link to that quiz, which is free, no charge. You can also find it on npr.org. npr.org. I want to jump ahead because some of the things that we talked about just made me even more intrigued about my sister Fe. Sugar daddies. Let's talk about sugar daddies.
Oh Lord Jesus. Whew. What do you want to know about sugar daddies? I mean, yeah, they exist. And I've been propositioned by a few, but then I realized the nature of that relationship. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I didn't have a father in my life, and I'm not looking to have a man in my life to act as my father.
Mhm.
And I don't want somebody, I value myself so much greater than having a transaction where I do something and you pay me for it. It's like, either I'm going to do it because I want to, regardless of what it is, or not. And I don't need to be compensated for things that I feel that you should be in a normal relationship in order to get. And I understand that extenuating circumstances puts people in different positions to do X, Y, and Z. And by no means am I judging anybody for anything that they've ever had to do in their lives, because we've all had to sacrifice and we've all had to take the L to get to where we are. But for me, I don't want a sugar daddy. I have no desire to have one. I have been propositioned by many sugar daddies in the past, and I'm like, thanks, but no thanks. I don't have daddy issues like that, and I don't need to have one in my life that's going to treat me as such. And at the end of the day, I'm more than just property. I'm more than just a body or a piece of meat. I'm a person that loves really deeply. I care about the world as a whole. I care about society and environments, and I'm trying to do what I can to change that narrative of that everything's going to hell in a handbasket.
We're going to have to talk more in depth about that at a later time. I want to jump to the next talking point. See, this is why we're doing multiple episodes of this Trauma Shaman Breaking Generational Curses, because that, just talking about sugar daddies in and of itself, that's a whole show by itself, because we know that gets into trafficking, that trafficking conversation a whole lot. when we think of trafficking, that stigma and stereotype and taboo is still somebody coming over from Europe in a shipping container, or somebody being packed in a van or some truck crossing the US Mexico border. Like this is all foreigners that are being trafficked. And it's like, no, trafficking is big business here in the good old US of A, all day, every day, and twice on Sundays. And we got, excuse me, we got some major trafficking operations that are being held and taking place in a lot of your major and even smaller market cities across the U.S. And they're not being sent overseas. It's happening right here. And some of the people that I've been talking to that have been trafficked when they were younger, and then they got out of that life, and now they're advocates. Some of the stories they tell me, it's like, man, they were sold by their parents, their caregivers, uncle, a trusted family friend. I mean, we've done all kind of stories on trafficking, So again, we'll talk about that on another show. You are an energy reader. Tell us about that.
Well, that was so. One of the things that I want to let everybody know is that from the moment that we are born, we all have these abilities to be psychic, to be healers, or energy readers, or what have you. And as we get older, because our belief system dwindles, because society likes to say that metaphysics doesn't exist. It's just nothing more than hocus pocus. It's devil work or the voodoo, blah blah blah. So I come from a line of very spiritual women. My great grandmother, my grandmother, and my mother, they were all born with veils over their heads. And for anybody that's from the South, you know that means that they can talk to spirits, or they can communicate with the spirit world. And so after all of my healing from trauma, I realized that I had these abilities. And that, I think because of my childhood and all the trauma that I've experienced, it's made me highly sensitive. So I'm a highly sensitive empath. And what that means is I can feel people's energy before I've even come into contact with them. I could be having a conversation with them via a phone call or a text message, and I can feel exactly whatever energy that they're giving off. Because you think about it, everything, including us, is made up of energy. And it's all about attracting the right kind of energy. And so oftentimes when there's a little bit of energy imbalance, I can feel that. I can walk into a room that's got 500 people in it, and I can tell you within 2 minutes, the good people, those that are somewhat in the middle, and those that it's like, you want to stay the hell away from them because they're toxic as fuck. And that's one of the reasons why I minimize my contact with. I don't go into large crowded situations, environments, concerts, because it's like I'm a magnet. I attract everybody's energy, and I'm trying to keep my own energy balanced. And then if I've got someone, it's almost like you're being pelted with rocks. Just you're walking, and all of a sudden you're just being pelted with rocks. And so for me, I have to minimize my contact because of the fact that I can read people's energy. I can feel it. If somebody says I'm not feeling well, I can feel all the energy that is associated with it, whether it's a stomach ache, a headache, a nosebleed, or a dripping nose, what have you. And so I make sure that anytime that I do go out and I'm being social, which I like to be social, I try to keep my social in my social excursions to a small quantity of people, because that way I can give them attention, they can give me attention, and we're all kind of commingling together. But as far as like going to big, huge, crowded events, I can't handle it. I'm like, no, first of all, there's way too much noise because I hear different frequencies. And I'm like, no, there's frequencies, there's bad energy, and I don't want any parts of it. So I'm just going to stay at home, or I'll just gather in smaller groups where I can maintain my own energy and it doesn't get zapped. Because that's another thing, is being in large crowds of people. Oftentimes my energy gets zapped because people gravitate towards me. They feel like, oh, I'm a good person, or I'm somebody that they want to get to know. And the next thing you know, they're telling me their life stories, and I'm exhausted. I'm like, I didn't even get a chance to set myself up before I'm having this experience with this person. And now I have to go retreat home and be home for a week or what have you, with uninterrupted just me time, just so I can get back to the state of where I was.
I got two more questions before we get to the shameless plug section, which is where, again, the mic is yours. You're going to tell us how people can get in touch with you. I'll provide those links and all that stuff, whatever you got coming down the pike, how people can, get anything that maybe any merchandise, or if you got any books coming out, or whatever you got going on. Definitely your podcasters. I absolutely love to hear place like that. It's a great podcast. Um, First question. We talk about labels on this podcast. When we're talking about people who have experienced trauma, we talk about survivors. Mrs. LP told me when I started to talk about formulating this podcast, she said, look, there's only two reasons you use the word victim. You're talking about somebody that died or was killed, or you're talking about the crime itself. She said, don't ever call somebody who experienced trauma a victim. So in the course since that time, I've heard many different people that I've interviewed on the show, and some that are still waiting in the wings for their episode to be produced or published, that said, I don't like surviving. One lady said she was good with victim and she laid it all out. She said, just because I was victimized, that makes me a victim, but it doesn't make me weak. It doesn't make me somebody who can overcome these things. I just don't call myself overcome. And so, but I've had people that say, I don't like survivor, I like champion, I like overcomer, I like triumphant, I like victor or victorious, I like persistent, all kind of different adjectives that they refer to themselves as instead of survivor. For you, what word works for you?
You really want to know that word? So, as much as I hate labels, I don't like them because I think it when you label someone, it's almost like you're putting them in a box. And so I've lived in a box for the greater part of my life, so I don't like being boxed into anything. And in fact, I'll tell somebody, you can take your box and shove it up your ass. But as it relates to childhood trauma and just me healing from it, I like to refer to myself as a fucking warrior because I'm not a survivor. I'm not a thriver. I'm not a champion. For me, I'm a warrior because a warrior is someone who's always ready for battle. And just like we know, trauma is always going to find a way to ease back into your life. Just when you think life is great, will somehow come into your life, whether it be a person or it could be something as simple as an experience. And you have to know how to get yourself out of that experience so that your vibrations doesn't change. So it does not cause you as a person to fall from where you were and what you have worked so far from. So I like to refer to myself as a fucking warrior. My friends have jokingly called me Wonder Woman in the past, which I'm like, yeah, that can be said too. And
Yeah,
depending on the day, I could be Wonder Woman, or I could be wondering, what am I doing? What I'm wondering, where are my keys? Where's my phone? So Wonder Woman could be both, a really positive, uplifting thing, but also in my response, in my regards, it can also be a way to break the ice and make people laugh. So,
last question. If Fee could write a letter or an email to little Fee at whatever age, what would she say?
I would tell little Fee, that she has worked so hard to become the person that she is. And that just because she may have had a rough beginning, that does not mean that it should dictate how she moves throughout the world, and more importantly, how her story or how her legacy ends. Because even when it's my time to go, which I've already seen it firsthand, I'm not dying until I'm well into my damn 90s. So I'm going to be around for a long time. But I would tell little Fee to create the kind of legacy that her children would be proud to pass the torch on to their very own children, and to never let anybody break your peace. If there's one thing that is most sacred to myself, and that's my peace, I refuse to let anybody or anything break the peace that I've worked so hard for. So if that means that I have to eliminate things or people out of my life in order for my peace to be where it is, I guess what? You're going to have to go bye-bye, because that's something that I'm not willing to negotiate on.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I love that. And I ask that question almost every time with each person, each guest on this Trigger Warning Talk podcast, because I want people to start thinking of that question because I really strive to get people to journal. Uh, Actually, after this interview, I'm going to be jumping back into these clubhouse streets. I do along with my partner, Coach Kim, Coach K Renee, we do a journaling room and Loyalty and Friends on Wednesday nights at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we're going to do it a little later today, but it's called Speak Sister, Brother Speak. I'm the Brother Speak side. And so for about an hour, I'll come up with a journaling question. I'll play some music associated with that question to give people kind of a backstory to why that question is on the table. And then it's up to people to share. They can read whatever they wrote. They can put it in the chat. They can back channel me or what have you if they want me to read it without saying who they are. Or they can just listen in. And so I love that answer that you gave because it's your answer. It's your statement to you, to Lil Fee. Shameless plug time. On the screen, I got your IG and I got your anchor page for the Healing Place with Fee. Let's talk about the Healing Place with Fee. Tell us about that because that's your podcast.
So the healing place with Fee. So I have to say that my super big brother, he's not my biological brother, but I view him as like the biggest brother I could possibly ever ask to have. His name is Rick Party. He's a nationally syndicated radio host. He was the one who inspired me to create this podcast because he's heard my story and he was like, Fee, people need to hear your story. They need to hear what it's like to be a trauma survivor because we hear about people going through trauma, but we never hear about the healing and we never get to hear the steps that they walked through to get to that point. And then more importantly, just the bliss from not having to hold on to all of that trauma anymore. And so the healing place with Fee is like an audio book for myself that I created. And I have guests that come onto my show and they share their stories of trauma and more importantly how it's affected their lives, but then also the necessary work that they've done to be able to get to a point where they feel like that they are okay or that they've made peace with it. So it's an ever evolving platform, an ever evolving podcast. Ultimately, that podcast is going to be one of the tools that I use to write my book because I'm
Okay.
also writing a book. It's called Survivor's Guide to Overcoming Trauma, where I add a little bit of humor, but there's a lot of seriousness in the book where I talk about, things that I've experienced in my past. But then there's a little bit of that new feed that gets to come out where you see the sarcastic feed, the funny feed, the lovable feed, the peaceful feed that comes out because through trauma comes healing. Through healing comes love. Through love comes peace and balance, harmony, and any other adjectives that you want to put along with that. So, yeah, it's my baby. I love my podcast. I'm the type of person that I love. I love talking. I love being able to either talk to people or have people talk to me. So this was a way for me to be able to say, "Hey, this is one way in which I can help others heal is by giving them that safe space where they can sit and I can listen and I can help them to navigate through their own journeys or just be there to say, you know what? You did a great job. Let me pat you on the back. Let me give you your flowers, your much deserved earned flowers." And so my podcast or my Instagram that has evolved over the last like couple of months too. Because as I continue to get these downloads from my spirit guides and they're telling me which direction I need to go, that's how my Instagram has kind of evolved into now it's the trauma shaman. And so what I do on my Instagram page is I just share words of encouragement, or if I see a meme that I feel like this is going to hit home, I'm going to post it. But then instead of just posting it, I post a personal message that goes along with it, so that it's not only just something that was just somebody else shared it and shared it and shared it. I'm adding that extra fee flair to it so that you can see how I'm interpreting it And then more importantly, how someone else can sit there and they can look at it and they can articulate it in such a manner that they're like, man, that was good stuff. Let me pass this on to somebody else. So I'm just nothing more than an advisor, just advising people on some of the things that they should do to help them live their best lives. And I use myself as the guinea pig.
And how often is your show published or posted?
Well, this is a hard one because so I usually try to post a new episode, once or twice a month. It depends because, like right now, I'm spending a great deal of time going back and doing my writing for my book. So I'm
Okay.
kind of burning the candle on two ends, and so I haven't given my podcast nearly as much attention as it deserves. But that is going to change because, like I said, the podcast is going to lead the way for the book, and a lot of my inspiration will come from my podcast that will be thrown into the book. So I'm going to be getting back into recording new episodes. In fact, I have two new episodes that I have to post. One is called The Inner Child and Why It's Important to Heal. And then the other one is Trauma Healing and Motivation. What motivates one to heal after they've experienced trauma? So those are two new episodes that I'm going to be posting. And I'm actually going to be doing a little bit more of a deeper dive into the shadow work and what are some of the characteristics of the shadow that we all possess that we don't necessarily pay attention to. So more brand new stuff to be coming down the pipeline. I guess it's just trying to find the time to do it because I got four kids at home and a dog and a husband that constantly needs my attention. And I'm like, all right, I got to find a way to squeeze myself into there and do some things that are beneficial for me, like making sure that my podcast I'm constantly putting out new content because I think that's important.
I want to tell y'all, if you haven't seen or listened to The Healing Place with Fee, it's a great podcast. I am someone who I'm a fan of authors. I'm a fan of mental health professionals, first responders, and I'm also a fan of podcasters in terms of I like looking at different podcasts and listening and see how people do their shit, or like, do they got all these bells and whistles, or is it kind of like me? It's like, hey, this is going to be very organic, but straight to the point, and we're going to deep dive into the shit or whatever. We got part one that we just knocked out the park. I want to give everybody a heads up. Part two is going to be Trauma Shaman, Breaking Generational Curses, the Royals version. And specifically the Royals version because, and I'm going to let Fee tell us why we're focusing on the Royals. And I'm talking about the Royals. I'm talking about the people over in England that live in the Buckingham Palace. Why are we focusing on the Royals, Fee? I'm going to give you the mic.
Well, two of my favorite people, and I'm actually getting chills thinking about them, are Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. So even before Meghan became this powerhouse that she is, um, Prince Harry, he's always been focused on the importance of mental health, and especially with him losing his mother so young. It was his initiative from the get go. And so, of course, no one knows or understands the trauma of one, especially when they lose their parent. Some people are completely devastated, and some people they're on autopilot. And so, what I love about Prince Harry is that he never once changed to his identity never changed as he continued to fight for what was right, and that was about the importance of mental health. Because just like we go to the doctors and we get physicals and we get our shots and what have you, we have to make sure that we tackle the importance of mental health because you can't expect a car to run with no oil if you don't continuously keep the maintenance of it. And so that was one of the things that I fell in love with about Prince Harry. And then when Meghan Markle came onto the scene, I was like, oh my God, there's somebody that looks like me. Because I've always, for the better part of my life, I've always had a little bit of an identity crisis because I never looked like anybody in my community. I never looked like anybody in my family. And then it was only a couple of years ago when I did an ancestry DNA that I realized just how multi-ethnic I was. And so I never saw people, whether it was in person or on the screen, that I could identify with. And so when Megan came along, I'm like, I can totally identify with her. She has a lot of traits, characteristics that I exhibit or that I am hoping to exhibit, what have you. And so just watching Meghan and Harry navigate this new life together, and the effects of their mental health and how their own mental health had been compromised, I was like, this is just BS. But that just goes to show you that you could be in a royal family and still come from a really fucked up environment and still need to do the necessary work in order to you for you to heal mentally. And so that's what I love about them. And they since then have gone on to create their company Archwell, which I have already put out in the universe that I am definitely going to be collaborating with them in the future. They just don't know it yet. But I told my spirit guides, you need to start talking to Meghan and Harry because that's eventually the route we need to go. But I love what they represent and what they're trying to create is they're trying to create this environment that's based on, hey, we've got people that are traumatized walking around. They don't necessarily know that there are resources out there, and furthermore, they don't even know how to go about the resources. Because I mean, when I was a kid, there were no resources. I
Right.
had to go out of my community in order to see these resources. And so my whole goal is with talking about the royals is like how they're reaching above and beyond what they're exposed to reach back and pull those people, those underserved, marginalized people forward to say, it's not okay for you to have to suffer in silence. And I love that about them. So I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Yeah, and we're gonna deep dive into the generational curses that the royals have historically dealt with, or not dealt with, or
Hmm.
properly dealt with.
Or as I like to call it, the stiff upper lip.
Stiff upper lip. Part three is going to be where we're talking about, again, because we are intentional. We don't just do dialogue here. This is not, some chatty patty stuff or whatever. We're not trauma dumping here. So it's dialogue with action plans. So part three, because every show and even this one, we talked about seeking help, what forms of help you sought after, and what you're doing to maintain being a warrior who's dealing with this lingering trauma, because it doesn't go anywhere.
Absolutely.
So part three is going to be trauma shaman, breaking generational curses, focusing on healing, focus on specifically therapy, and we'll get more into those metaphysical therapies and talking about metaphysics, even on a broader scale. Because
Hmm.
again, when you talk about metaphysics, first thing kind of comes to people's minds is, like I said, either demonology or snake oil salesperson.
Yeah.
So we'll get into all of that in part three, and we're going to add more and more to this generational curses because, again, you are the trauma shaman, you are the enlightenment. I'm going to call you my friendly neighborhood Dalai Lama. You know, I'm going to have to reach out to you to have you do a reading for me because I had a lady who her interview is coming out, I believe, next month, and actually, Marcella did a tarot card reading. We just didn't get it on camera.
Hmm.
And I was, I'm all nervous. I'm like, what if it's something bad and shit or whatever? It's like, but I said, you know what? The next time I run across somebody that does tarot readings, I'm just gonna have them do it on camera, and we just gonna lay it out, good, bad, ugly, and different. Because hey, I'm human. I'm not above reproach or anything like that.
Hmm.
And let's just have a conversation because
Absolutely.
we're gonna find a way to deal with whatever is in the cards, pun intended. I want to have you hold on while I do this last portion, which is our missing persons section. We do a missing
Totally.
person case every time, every time, every time, every time. This is from Mrs. LP. This story comes from MontanaRightNow.com. And let me bring it up on the screen here. This young lady died mysteriously. Her name is KAYSERA Stops Pretty Places. Listen to this story.
Pretty Places was found in the backyard of a home in Hardin, Montana. The family and friends are growing more and more frustrated every day with what they say is a lack of investigation into her murder.
Because she was murdered. She didn't die in that spot. She was placed there.
The medical examiner, he spoke to me. He told me what he could about what his involvement with the case. He told me that the cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation, by assault.
By speaking to her grandmother and aunt, I retraced the 18-year-old Indigenous woman's last known whereabouts up until her death. I also uncovered a series of missteps by law enforcement in the handling of her remains and the investigation into her death that all have her family believing she was killed and her death was covered up. And with very few answers today, I find out how they are joining hands with thousands of others who have lost loved ones to the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. And join me for season 5 finale of our Montana Murder Mysteries podcast, The Mysterious Death of KAYSERA Stops Pretty Places, Part 2. It's available now wherever you download your podcast.
KAYSERA Stops Pretty Places. Young Indigenous woman, because again, on this podcast, 99% of the missing persons cases that we cover are melanated men, women, and children. If they, and that includes if they were runaways, abducted, kidnappings. If that person is not missing, but in KAYSERA's situation, she died under mysterious circumstances, and nobody knows who her killer or killers are, or they haven't been adjudicated. We bring the same energy and media attention to these stories of these individuals because they need justice. They need closure. And so we don't have a problem with highlighting these stories. And I'm telling you, I don't give a damn about how people feel about it. I really don't. Because I've been asked, well, and it's like, look, if you don't want to hear it, go to another damn podcast. You don't like it, create your own platform. This is important. And again, I said 99%. I didn't say 100%. But even if I said 100%, damn it, is my show. So 99% of these cases we're going to cover. We're going to continue to cover. And I'm going to pull up another bit of information too that Mrs. LP gave me. I'm not going to play it, but I'm going to read off the contact information. So if anybody is if anybody has any information about her whereabouts or in terms of who may have done it, where it may have happened, all of that information. The information that they have here is you can contact the United States Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Service Missing and Murdered Unit, offered by the county attorney. I'll place that link in the show notes also because they didn't have a particular phone number that I saw right away. But again, KAYSERA Stops Pretty Places. Indigenous woman murdered mysteriously. Nobody knows who did it. We want to help in that cause. I want to thank you so much, Fe, for all that you are doing, all that you have done. I want to send healing energies to you because, again, trauma is trauma. We all can get it. Anybody can get it and anybody can give it. And we have to know how to become warriors in these traumatic situations that, unfortunately, we have all experienced on some level. For Fe, I am your brother, your Fire Medic CEO, LP. And as I always say in closing, live in awareness, never, ever, ever live in fear. LP out.
What's up?
What's up?
Man, yeah. I tell people all the time, you have to not live in fear because fear will keep you from being your better self. Fear will keep your ass in the house and you miss out on the best parts of life because you're too busy thinking about, the fear. What if they look or they feel this way? And it's like, at the end of the day, that's somebody else's opinion. It has no bearing on how you should navigate through life. And once you've mastered the ability to not live within fear, The possibilities are endless. And that's like we were having that conversation earlier on Clubhouse, and it was like the idea of death. And death used to be one of those things that I feared because my mother, she passed away when she was 42. My sister passed away when she was 50. My aunt passed away shortly before her 55th birthday. So there's a track record of the women in my family not living for very long periods of time. And so I remember when I turned 42, or I was approaching 42, I was like, I got to do everything I can to make it to 42. And then when I made it to 42, I was like, I got to do everything I can to make it to 43. And then after a while, I'm like, let me stop obsessing with the idea of I got to do everything I can to make it to my next birthday, and start living so that I can see my next birthday. Start enjoying life so that I can see my next birthday instead of living from a place of fear and being worried. Yes, there's a family history of a couple of different modalities that exist. However, my family didn't take care of themselves. They didn't go to the doctors. They didn't do things that were holistic for their bodies. They didn't take walks and exercise and eat well and drink water and sleep well. They did none of those things. So, of course, all of those things together contributed to the demise behind the reason why they're no longer here. And I'm like, you know what? I'm still thriving at 47. I'm not going to worry about my death certificate, or that my death stamp. Yes, I know that everybody we have a birth date, and then we have a death date. I'm too busy worried about the stuff in the middle to be worried about either one of these dates. So that's my philosophy, and I will continue to live life free and carefree and without fear, because fear will keep you from being your best self.
LP out.